Welcome to Preparing for AI, the AI podcast for everybody, with your hosts Jimmy Rhodes and me, Matt Cartwright. We explore the human and social impacts of AI, looking at the impact on jobs, AI and sustainability, and most importantly, the urgent need for safe development of AI, governance and alignment.
The ice age is coming, the sun's zooming in, engines stop running, the wheat is growing thin. A nuclear era, but I have no fear, 'cause London is drowning and I live by the river. Welcome to Preparing for AI, the AI podcast for everyone, with me, Jimmy Rhodes.
And me, Matt Cartwright.
Well, this is going to be a very different episode. We're going to be exploring trust, distrust, misinformation, control, and conspiracy theories. Narratives, division, polarization, and how AI is enabling and is going to make all of this worse. So there is a link here to AI, but this is going to be a bit of a broader episode because we wanted to talk about trust, information overload, and Matt's personal experience. And it seems like now is an opportune time.
So the trigger for this episode now is the disorder that we saw in the UK about a week or two ago. This started with an appalling tragedy in Southport in the northwest of England, where several children were stabbed and sadly 3 of those children died. The identity of the perpetrator was announced or leaked online, and some of the social media posts reported this was a Muslim who had arrived as an illegal immigrant on a small boat. Now, I believe this is not correct. The information subsequently was that this was a black British Christian born in South Wales. I think while I can't confirm what details are true or not, it's important to note the difference between what was leaked and what is now apparently correct there. But obviously it's difficult to know with anything what is the truth. But anyway, there was subsequently a riot and protest in Southport, which then led to protests in several British or English cities, most of which then turned into riots. And I think this is really important for some of the themes we're going to explore, counter-protests by groups with, for example, a pro-Palestine agenda. Maybe worth noting that here some of what have been dubbed far-right protesters were apparently also carrying Israeli flags. Now, definitely these crowds were not homogenous on either side. There's no doubt there were people here protesting on the grounds of immigration, people joining in for kicks in the same way as happens with football hooliganism, youngsters joining in because they're generally pissed off, possibly plants on both sides, and people who were there because they wanted to peacefully counter-protests, and typically anti-racist lefties, pro-Palestine elements is what I've seen in the media. A real cocktail of people from all kinds of different backgrounds with different views, and that's why this is so complicated an issue. But it's also something that's been brewing underneath for a long time. I think I naively didn't think immigration was such a huge issue in the UK anymore. I knew it was a big issue in the US and in France. But I have seen recently a lot of stuff around information, not just on small boats, that's not necessarily well reported, but is widely available. And it's brought home to me how big an issue this is. And we should point out, like I just said, the UK is not alone. This is brewing under in many, many countries, as well as the US and France, Germany, Sweden, Netherlands. You can see the result of elections recently and how important an issue this is. So what is the point of this issue and how does it connect with AI? Well, you will be glad to hear that we are not going to explore the specific issues of the UK's social fabric and immigration policies. We link this to AI because of so-called disinformation, and I really hate that word because I think it plays into who decides what is disinformation and what is just information. The winner, or often the state, or the ones with the power, control what is information and what's disinformation. And he who controls information controls history. And so what you're left with, and this is such a big issue because of our increasingly divided and tribal society, is two sides of who both think they're victims of misinformation. And as we discussed with Dan Lyons a month or so ago, and we're going to expand on today, it's this trust or distrust that I think is the underlying factor behind all of this. And AI is not only amplifying the issue, but it's going to make it easier and worse to both disinform, but also to shut down debate and control the narrative. And so as I've talked so much already, I'm going to ask Jimmy to talk a little bit more about the specific point as it references to artificial intelligence.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so there's an article here. It's by The Guardian. Little disclaimer. But yeah, it's basically talking about exactly what you were talking about there. And it links what we're talking about on the podcast back to AI. So when those stabbings unfortunately happened, quite soon afterwards there was an AI generated image, which was shared on X or Twitter, which it depicted bearded men in traditional Muslim dress outside the Houses of Parliament, and it was viewed nearly 1 million times. And it was captioned, "We must protect our children," and it's definitely, almost certainly, been part of the reason why things got out of control in the UK. It's fed into it, and so that's kind of the link back to AI. And the article also references platforms like Suno, which has been used to which we use to generate AI music. Unfortunately, that's also been used to generate online songs containing xenophobic content, all this kind of stuff. And recently I've seen there's better deepfakes are getting better and better. They're still not perfect, but they're probably good enough to fool most people. And so we're getting to that. We're already starting to see what we've been talking about for a little while on the podcast, which is that it's really hard. Well, it's very easy to back up whatever narrative you have online. And also it's becoming very hard to believe anything that you see online, because it could be AI generated content, it could be fake, it could be misinformation or information, but you don't know. And I think that's what we want to talk about for most of this episode.
Yeah, so I'm going to do something quite personal now. I'm kind of not sure about this, but to sort of open up about my own mental health struggles over the last 18 months or so, because it specifically pertains to information. And I don't call it disinformation for the reasons I mentioned in the beginning, because I don't think I have the right, or you could argue the intelligence, to decide what is true and what's not. I am, of course, as a private citizen, entitled to my opinion, but I'm not even sure of that. So, I've literally bombarded myself with information for the past 18 months, and I've probably been down a rabbit hole. And it's because I like to learn about everything. Like, I've always been super thirsty for knowledge. I used to sit on the tube in London and I would read the leaflets and pamphlets on insurance and stuff, because I just had this constant need just to be taking on information. And until recently, I spent several months not working. I was working on a part-time master's. I was doing loads of AI courses I've talked about on the podcast. And I was also doing what I will call my research into what's been going on in the world. And it's been interesting. And I think I'm far more knowledgeable than I was 6 months ago, and far more awake to some of the realities. But it's been a burden, and it's been incredibly draining. And I think I have heard and read about well into hundreds of theories around COVID, vaccines, global cabals, viruses not existing, the coming collapse of fiat currency, the collapse of the food chain, destruction of farming, reasons for the Ukraine war, Israel-Gaza, AI apocalypse, climate hoax, Rockefellers, WEF, WHO, fake bird flu, nanotech, 5G, 15-minute cities, eating insects, controlled opposition, you name it. I wanted to understand everything and find answers and understand why people believe things that are so opposite to each other, when surely I thought there should be evidence for a single truth. And what I found the most surprising is that 18 months later, I feel that for the first time I'm waking up, not because I believe all these theories or because they're all nonsense, but because I've realized I simply do not and cannot know what is true and what is not. It would be far easier to believe it's all the global cabal, that you can blame them for everything and not take responsibility for your life. Equally, it would be easy to say they're all nut jobs. Go back to my little micro world, watch the mainstream news and follow the narrative. But I can't put everything back in the box. And I'm sure something is wrong. I'm sure many of these conspiracy theories or truth or lies are all partly true. But I'm also sure some of them are complete nonsense. I mean, if nothing else, there are so many theories out there that they all end up contradicting each other, which kind of makes it impossible. So you either choose a side, and then you can easily believe you're better than the normies, the sheeple, the anti-vaxxers, the tinfoil hatters, the conspiracy theorists, the useful idiots, whatever you want to call them. And whichever side you're on is the key that you can feel you know, and they're just idiots that don't know anything. Create a them and look down on them, rather than realizing that maybe you're largely misguided. There might be some truth in there that you should explore. It reminds me actually of Jimmy a few weeks ago challenging voting based on your kind of tribal party, rather than what policies you actually think and that match your values. Our opinion on certain key issues, COVID, immigration, US versus China, Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, Russia, becomes our tribe as it's replaced our religion or our class. Although much of division certainly still happens along religious or class lines, where people still have a belief or a social group. So my last line here before we leave, or my last paragraph before we leave this monologue and start to have more of a debate, is that it's the sheer volume of information as well as the algorithm which creates the echo chamber that is why this is so dangerous now, and why it's been so dangerous to me personally. Never before have we had access to so much information, literally so-called evidence that can prove anything, but also with an algorithm that pushes you down a path that convinces you that you must be right and they must be idiots. You believe you've been engaged in critical thinking, but the very way your brain works has been shaped by the content you've been funneled into and shaped by social media platforms. And nothing is presented as opinion. Neither side wants to have a debate anymore. Everything is presented as irrefutable facts, and anyone who can't see that is an idiot, evil, or the enemy. Both sides believe it's freedom of speech, as long as you agree with me. Science is never settled. Just as one example, Jimmy and I talked about whether COVID leaked from a lab or not, and the furring cleavage site, which is what makes SARS-CoV-2 so easy to infect humans. We managed to find scientific peer-reviewed papers that proved or supported both sides of the argument, and it took us 3 or 4 minutes to do that. Now, science is always about constantly challenging, but how can normal people know what to believe, and I mean normal in a good sense here, when they literally can find information that tells them whatever they want to find or believe? The overload of information and the constant proving and disproving anything has driven me personally to the point of insanity. And do you know what I think is a solution? Religion or spirituality. Because in effect, every belief now is an act of faith and a clash between good and evil. I'm not saying which side is which, but it indicates to me that it's almost like a battle that only religion or faith can explain. So on that note, let's get into the debate.
So you said a few things there.
I've said quite a few things there.
Quite a few things there, but you used a few words which I'll be honest, I have issue with. Things like proving and disproving, and sort of fairly black and white phrases. And just going back to the debate we had about and the scientific papers that we looked up, I would not say that those papers proved or disproved anything. I would say they made an argument. In both cases, they made a rational argument one way or the other. The paper that I think I sent to you said that it's basically said that it's possible. It said that it's possible. It didn't try and disprove that it was created in a lab in that particular instance. And I think for me, that's a really critical point. And I find that quite often, like for when you and I have conversations, debates, discussions, we quite often do end up convincing each other one way or the other, or moving, maybe moving the needle slightly. And I feel like that's something that's lost online. And that's where this problem is that, and that's not specific to AI, that's social media, where it's kind of like everyone's in their little tribe and you've got to be in one gang or the other. Now, my attitude to a lot of these things is, I don't know the answer. And there are a lot of things where, and obviously that percentage changes, I suppose. I read a lot of scientific stuff. I follow a lot of maths channels. I follow a lot of physics channels. And, most of that stuff, especially the stuff on the fringe, is open to saying, I don't know the answer. This is what we think it is. This is the latest theory. Then we need to test it. Then we need to go and try and understand it better. And that's something that I try to follow, is like that kind of scientific method, and try to always internally have a bit of a gauge on do I believe something or not, or is it like, actually, I've got no idea. And with a lot of the things that you're talking about, I'll be honest, I have no idea. And a lot of them are quite human points as well, where it's it's one side arguing, so there probably isn't a right answer. It's like the left versus the right arguing over things like immigration that you talked about earlier on. With something like COVID, I'm sure there is a right answer somewhere, but I don't think we'll ever find out. That's the problem there. And there's a lot of things like that in the world as well. There's a lot of things. I mean, I don't even like the word conspiracy theory because it's one of those little badges that you put on something which basically says, well, it's a conspiracy theory, so it's obviously nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this now, but I just like to call them theories. And that's not, that kind of plays into that, oh, well, Matt's a conspiracy theorist. Well, no, I just think it's arrogant to decide what is and what isn't true. And like you say, this idea of labeling it conspiracy theory is actually to kind of push into a basket that is, if you believe this, you are X.
Yeah, and this is the problem, isn't it? There's a conspiracy theory, the conspiracy theory basket is something that lots of stuff gets chucked into. Now, if you talk to me about flat Earth, for example, and sorry if we've got any.
Prove it, Jimmy.
Huh?
Prove it.
Well, I can't prove it, but I would say I'm pretty confident, and there's lots of very good evidence in that particular example that we are obviously on a flat Earth, but no, quite the opposite. But whereas some of the other stuff you talked about, it's like it gets put in the same basket as that kind of stuff, where it doesn't necessarily belong there, or there are margins or degrees of whether that's correct or not. And this stuff is really complicated, and this is the whole point of the podcast right today, is that AI, bringing it back to AI, I mean, it's a combination of things. It's not just AI, like social media and the internet's been around for a while, which means free speech has been extended as a platform. These platforms have extended free speech to everyone in the world. So everyone in the world's got opinions. The algorithms mean that you end up getting lumped in with a load of other people with similar opinions, and they reinforce information, whether it's correct or incorrect. They reinforce that, and they put you in that echo chamber, like you said. And AI is, unfortunately, AI might have a lot of benefits. There might be lots of really good things that come out of AI, but this is an area where it's going to be a huge, huge problem. Because soon you're going to be able to generate videos, images, voice of people saying or doing whatever you want. And I am really scared about that. I'm genuinely really scared about that when it comes to things like elections and democratic processes. And I don't think there is a solution yet. I mean, you've got, there are certain things like where you've got things like Twitter, where you've got your blue tick and things like that, which maybe do sort of help a little bit with this in terms of like verifying accounts and things. I think something similar is needed somehow for AI, so that when the ultimate version of Sora comes out, when something that can produce pixel perfect, audio perfect video, for example, we really do need something to be built into a system like that, so that it's got a fingerprint that says it's AI generated. The problem is open source is sort of only a few steps behind closed source stuff, and how long's that going to last? How long is it going to be until there's an open source model created by somebody who wants to do harm, which can doesn't have such fingerprints and that kind of thing? So I think it's only ever going to be a short-term solution in that sense, and I don't know what the answer is.
I think a long time ago, maybe the first few episodes that we did, we already talked about this actually.
Yeah.
So it's this idea of kind of post truth, where we get to a point that we actually said, you can't believe anything, and therefore you just don't believe anything. So you literally don't believe anything you don't see with your own eyes. If you could get to that point, I actually think that's better than we are now. I'm not sure we do get to that point, because, even if you find that, for example, mainstream media, and by mainstream I don't mean the BBC, CNN, I mean all of the kind of media of a reasonable size are governed by certain rules around, declaring that something is AI and something is not. The democratization, if you want to call it that, of media and of social media means that people can kind of view, whatever they want on whatever kind of platform they want. So, they don't need to view it on a regulated platform. It would rely on all of the social media platforms to be regulated. Anyway, I kind of want to pull you back to a point I wanted to make on that around who controls information, or who decides what is disinformation. So I think the most obvious examples we can have are big pharma controlling the medical industry and big tech controlling the tech industry and AI, etc. So, two of the big ones there. And I think, I should just point out at this point, the issue here, what we're trying to raise, what is true and what isn't true, kind of doesn't really matter for the episode. I think that's a separate rabbit hole that we're not going to go down on this episode. So, whether some of these theories are true or not, if they are, some of the kind of theories out there, it's horrible for the world. And if it's, and it's terrible, so many people are asleep to them. But if they're not true, we still have a massive issue, maybe even a bigger issue, that we've got this hugely divided society where a substantial percentage of people believe passionately that it is true and that all the people that don't believe it are idiots. And we did some research actually on this. So before we even started it, me and Jimmy had a chat before we decided to do this episode around how many people believe in the concept of the global cabal and depopulation. So for those not familiar with it, that would be that the WEF, the WHO, the UN, etc., the Rockefellers, all the big, famous families are controlling the kind of deep state. And there is a depopulation agenda, which is partly explains, COVID vaccines, shutting down the farming industry, etc., etc. So this is obviously, this is not a definitive answer because we're asking Claude to look at things that are out there. So we asked it to look at things like memberships of sort of conspiracy theories, as they're so-called, networks. It looked at how many people had voted a certain way, various kind of factors, and then tried to estimate. So this is very much an estimate. But in the US, 20 to 30% of people, believed at least to a reasonable degree in the global cabal having a depopulation agenda. And in most of Western Europe, it was between 18 and 25%. So varied a little bit between kind of Italy, France, the UK, Netherlands, etc. So if that's true, and we're fucked because we only have a quarter of people are aware and trying to battle this, or it's bollocks, and we only have 25% of society who have been radicalized and are very, very motivated and hell-bent on trying to bring down the system. So I don't know what my question is for you, Jimmy, but just putting kind of that out there, that is the position that we're in at the moment. Regardless of which of the sort of extreme views or not extreme views is true.
Yeah, and I've got an article here. I mean, this is again, disclaimer. This is like 5 years old now. So, but there was an extensive study actually done into conspiracy. Well, again, what they're branding conspiracy theories, I guess. But yeah, like depending on what it was, and I think the overall point was that only 50% of people didn't believe in any of them. So I think overall what it showed to me is the overall level of sort of mistrust in authority, in governments in general, and in sort of in governments basically, which is quite worrying, but also, like, again, as we talked about already, this kind of problem that this is only going to get worse. And you talked about the fact that social media should be regulated, but I feel like the horse is already bolted in that respect, because the internet is a thing, and you can't really rewind time on that, because I don't think it's down to any one specific platform. And how do you actually regulate that? I mean, interestingly, so just this week, Google have actually lost a big case in the US, which might actually result in Google being broken up. And this is all around the monopolization of search results. And there are similar court cases going on for, I think, Apple and some of the other big tech firms in the US. And one of the positive things, I suppose, is that it seems like regulation around AI is being given consideration up front, so that maybe we don't make some of the same mistakes that we've made with social media this time around. Because obviously, pre 15 years ago, 20 years ago, social media wasn't even a thing at all. And obviously all this kind of stuff has proliferated because of the internet.
I wanted to go back a little bit, this idea of sort of who controls the narrative and why that kind of frightens me. Because in one sense, I think, well, as you know, we need to clamp down on things, and clamping down on things means, stopping certain freedoms. And it would mean that you to be honest, have to have a agreed kind of narrative. And then the more I think about that, the more that kind of scares me. And there's I guess, a comparison here to open and closed source models, right? In terms of a closed source model is this idea of a narrative that is controlled by someone who's got our best interests at heart. And if that is the case, and they had our best interests at heart, then that would probably work. But if they haven't, then it's like a closed source large language model where, do we trust OpenAI with it? And I think that's the same with the narrative here. And what has bothered me a lot recently is about the talk of misinformation or disinformation is really just, disinformation is just what I don't agree with. It's the opposite side. And I think one thing that has annoyed me a lot, I looked at a BBC article about the riots that we were talking about, earlier in the episode in the UK. And the article was about someone who had sort of retweeted the original the original tweet, which had identified that it was an undocumented migrant who had apparently committed the murders of the children. And the person who had retweeted it, as far as I could tell, was not a celebrity or an influencer. It was a normal person with not much of a following on social media, but somehow this got picked up. And in the description of the person, to decide that they were distrustful or distrustworthy, it decided to say that through their search history, they had, been promoting anti-vax sentiments around COVID. Now, we're not getting into our views on vaccines, but suffice to say, I think it is fair for someone to have a view about the COVID vaccines, even if not on vaccines in general, and that should not be something that is used to decide whether that person is right or wrong on another opinion. And this all falls into a pattern that I've seen a lot recently about how, identifying where someone doesn't follow the official narrative on any particular issue means that they're not trustworthy on any other issue. And it kind of comes into politics as well, doesn't it? Even with Trump, it's nothing that Trump can do it can possibly be good because Trump bad, rather than being able to look at, well, just because, you disagree with him doesn't mean that everything he says is wrong. I use the Trump example because it's probably the one that's in the media the most, and he is the one that in the kind of media that I tend to read, he's obviously kind of chastised. And I'm not a big Donald Trump fan, but I don't think that everything he says, is without merit. But the way in which the narrative is shaped is to create 100% bad, 100% good. There's no nuance in it at all. And I see that, happening, like I say, to a big scale with politicians. But when you see that happening with a member of the public whose opinion cannot be trusted because they don't have the view that let's be honest, the national media organization has around COVID vaccines, I find that quite frightening. And I'm not a big proponent of free speech. I'm not, I actually quite, in many ways, I think there should be restrictions. I've said that, my view around AI and governance. So I'm not a libertarian or anything like that, but I find this thing frightening. I really do.
I think with this example, it's the same thing, right? It's we need to find a way to discredit somebody because you're writing an article, whoever it was that was writing that article, they don't agree with your narrative or the narrative you're putting across in the article on that day. And so you do whatever you can to try and discredit them to, presumably the people that are reading your articles. And
this is the BBC, though. I mean, I know a lot of people don't like the BBC, but that to me is not, you would expect that in certain types of media, absolutely in partisan media, but this is happening now in what is supposed to be, the BBC is not supposed to have a view, really. I mean, yeah, okay, we know that it does, but it's not, I find it more shocking because it's this kind of, like I say, what is officially national but an independent media. I would expect it from the Guardian or the Daily Mail because, you can see that they have a view and that's a bit, yeah, exactly. They've got an agenda. I think that's why it shocked me more because it was a BBC, and maybe I shouldn't be. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised. Maybe I'm being naive here.
Yeah, I feel like this is in general the sort of way the narrative goes. But I also think, one of the things I did want to say is that this is not like there's some of the tools that are available to, get to put information out there. I'll just call it information. But some of the tools that are available to be able to, for individuals to put information out there, is new. Like most of it is new. So social media, all that kind of thing. But this kind of thing has also been a thing for centuries. Like trying to control the narrative around things, whether it's religion, whether it's media, whether it's governments, whether it's, this has always been a thing. And actually kind of this sort of feeds into the global cabal thing. Like, I'll be honest, like I don't put any credence in that at all. But like, there's always been governments and, wealthy people and powerful people with power have always tried to control the narrative and have always tried to set the agenda and have always tried to have things their way. And I think that's just normal. That's just that's the way things have been for a very, very long time. I think the difference now is the avenues and the technologies and the platforms on which you can actually spread this kind of information.
Yeah, I want to go into an example, and because it's the obvious one. I know it's my favorite thing to talk about, AI and COVID, but I think COVID as the example is the best example because of the number of different narratives there are on this issue, and there is a lot of really good, believable. I use evidence. I know you don't like the term, and I agree with you. For what it's worth, when I say evidence, I talk about it because it's being portrayed as evidence, not because it is evidence. But there is a shifting in the mainstream narrative that is happening now, very, very slowly. But excess deaths, vaccines, etc., links back to big pharma. There is definitely a slow shift in the narrative, but the mainstream narrative is still generally, vaccines are safe and effective. COVID is not really an issue, and you shouldn't really worry about it. And then you can go into literally 1,000 different things on the one side around, the causes. And like I say, there is, again, portrayed as evidence that we have nanotechnology injected into us. There is evidence that, 5G towers are causing electromagnetic frequency that is causing the illness that people thought was COVID. There is evidence that it was always flu and other things. There is evidence that it was parasites. There is evidence that it is all the vaccines, which the COVID pandemic was engineered to allow the injection of the vaccines. There is also evidence that, lots and lots of people are getting long COVID. There is evidence that no one's getting long COVID and it's all from the vaccines. There are so many different narratives here, and so much information around each of them, and so many people who have bought into them and have, are so bought in that then, as we said, the algorithm continues and it feeds more and more information that keeps you believing that you're right and everybody else is wrong. And then, of course, the big thing, were mistakes made or was it all a pandemic? And if you don't believe that it was a pandemic, then you're an idiot. And if you do believe it was a pandemic, then you're an idiot. I guess, again, like it's always kind of been like it, but I would say that in the past there was maybe one or two views. Like there was a theory that people would call a conspiracy theory, and it was one conspiracy theory. The thing is now, when you go into the COVID conspiracy theory in inverted commas, there's not one, there's 1,000. And there is a pretty significant amount of people who believe and have evidence for each of them. And do you know what? I'm sure some of them are right, and some of them are wrong.
You know that people you can't see you.
They can hear the intonation in my voice. Don't worry, I know that they know. Our listeners are quite intelligent, Jimmy.
And this is why, I'll be honest, my personal sort of, and you can say this is burying my head in the sand, but a lot of this stuff I just kind of gloss over and don't even entertain it and it's not because. Just to clarify, it's not because I don't think it's possible or I don't necessarily believe it. It's because I know it's because I know exactly what you're saying, which is that there's going to be 1,000 different answers, and there's going to be an answer for every there's going to be a narrative that fits whatever you want to believe on a lot of these things. And so my conclusion is that I'll never know the answer, and therefore I'll just crack on and as I say, like I follow a lot of science things, and there's a lot of that I can believe in because I understand it, and I can, it takes you through, like, it's logical. It takes you through the logical steps, and it also admits that it might not always have all the answers. Whereas with a lot of the things we're talking about, it's got a lot of emotion mixed up in it. It's got a lot of information on all sides mixed up in it. It's got probably a lot of you said misinformation is. Again, like, I don't want to say, I'm not saying misinformation in terms of my side is right, because I don't have a side. I'm saying there's misinformation on both sides in all of these things. And that's because there's a sort of like emotional investment from all sides on it.
You're in the absolute best place to be honest. I think you're right. I think for me, the answer it's easier said than done, but the answer is just don't look at any of it. Just don't look at any of it and like you say, crack on. That actually is the answer. I mean, I stopped looking at Twitter months and months ago. I haven't looked at it since. I post our podcast on it, or I post a link to a podcast on it, and I literally open it and I close it as fast as I can, so I can't get dragged into it. And that is the answer. YouTube. I logged into YouTube today through the browser instead of the app, so I didn't get and I actually got a really nice video that I got pulled into that was really, really useful and helpful to me, rather than the usual rubbish. But I use my personal experience for this episode because I think it makes it more real, and it allows us to have that conversation that's a bit more focused. But actually the concern for me is, like, most people are using social media all the time. And even if I manage to just pull myself away from it and say, do you know what? Like I've said, I now acknowledge that I just think I'll never know. I can have an opinion, but there's too much out there for me to ever be intelligent enough to decide what is right and what is wrong. What? But there are so many people who I don't know if it's most people. I think it's most people. It's definitely more than 50% of people are generally obsessed with social media. And once, maybe at the moment they're looking at cat pictures and football, etc., etc. But I can tell you from my experience that it doesn't take long to click on something and then get dragged into something else, and bang, the algorithm's twisted around, and then you just get dragged into stuff. That's the issue, is whether I am able to say, do you know what, I'm done with this, I'm not interested. That stuff is out there, and it is dragging more and more people in, and proven by the fact that when we had the first conversation, that we looked up how many people buy into stuff, and like I said, 20 to 30% of people in the US, whether it's right or wrong, as I said before, if it's right, then wow, how can so few people know? And if it's wrong, then wow, how many people believe something that is so completely wrong?
You said you don't know if you'll be intelligent enough to know the answers to some of these things. I do.
I'm being humble.
Well, no, but also it's not about. I don't think this is about that. It's not about intelligence. Like the smart thing to do, I think, is to realize when you don't have the information to make an informed decision on something, and understanding that. And I think that's definitely something that I try to do with everything. It's like you said, do you sit in one political part? Do you lean one way politically or another? It's like, well, no, I mean, the smart thing to do is to listen to all sides and sort of take a balanced view. And it's never, I 100% agree with everything that Biden says, or I 100% agree with everything that Trump says. For me, I know it is for a lot of people, but that would be my recommendation and that would be, I would say that is critical thinking. It's kind of knowing when you don't know, and understanding the limits of your knowledge and wisdom. And this has been philosophized about for a long time as well. This is something that's, the Greeks were talking about this and discussing sort of what can you know, what don't you know, what's I think therefore I am. Is exactly about that. Basically, it's applying that philosophy to the modern world is probably the piece of advice I would give.
Should we break things up a bit? Shall we have it out with a rap battle?
Sounds like a great idea.
Cool. Let's do it.
Listen up, man, you conspiracy, addicted clown. I'm about to verbally smash your theories down. Your brain's rot from all that online junk, swallowing lies like a digital drug. You think you're woke, you're a sleeping sheep, shrouded in bullshit that's 10 miles deep. Wake the fuck been hacked by every crackpot with a hidden fact. Back off, Jimmy, you close-minded fool. You're just another system-loving tool. While you're blindly trusting the nightly news, I'm uncovering secrets, paying my dues. Hiding viruses, shadow governments too. Open your eyes, this shit ain't new. You're living in a dream world, perfectly numb, while the real puppet masters pull on your thumb. You've lost your damn mind, man, you tinfoil hat freak. Your facts are weaker than your rhyming technique. You sneak bogeyman in every fucking shadow. Your theories are deep as a kiddie pool shallow. You're not uncovering jacks, just circle jerking. With other basement dwellers, reality shirking. Get off your ass, step into the light. Real life's complex, not black and white. Fuck your complexity, that's their smoke screen to blind sheep like you from the truth unseen. I'm 10 steps ahead, you're stuck in the past, swallowing propaganda that was built to last. And it's a weapon, but also a key to unlock the chains and finally be free. You see a mirror, I see through the glass, at the puppeteers pulling strings en masse. It's so far gone, you can't see straight, drowning in fear, anger and hate. Your research is a joke, a pathetic farce, cherry-picking bullshit to show up your arse. So grand conspiracies pulling the strings, shows great stupidity causing these things. But that's too boring for your adult brain, so you craft fairy tales to explain your pain. Pain, the only pain is watching you sleep through the biggest mindfuck in history. COVID cabals, it's all connected, but your brain's too warped to get I expected. Call me crazy, but at least I'm aware of the webs they weave in the open air. You're lost in the sauce, a blue pill mess, while I'm fighting the power causing distress. In distress.
Well, that was nice. That was a change, something different. Did you enjoy that?
Well, I created it, so yeah.
Oh, did you? I thought we both created it, and that was the two of us just off the cuff.
It did sound like you.
Yeah, it did. It sounded it sounded more like me than you.
One thing that I do wish that I could do with Suno is get it to do two different voices consistently. It doesn't do that very well.
We could have just done the voices ourselves.
We could. I'm sure it would have been epic. But I am a accomplished rapper.
Do you know, I actually did a rap in my. I mean, this might explain a lot about my kind of mental health. I did a rap in the year 11 of high school. So when I'd be like 15, 16, I did a rap with two other guys called the Hitman in Assembly.
Nice.
I did the rap. One of the other guys used the drum machine, and the other guy was my hype man.
Nice. What was it about? Or should we not get?
It was about a hitman.
It was about a hitman.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, we digress. So, conspiracy theories or disinformation or misinformation or whatever we want to call it, has it always been like this?
Yeah. Well, I kind of mentioned it earlier on. I think it has. Like in terms of, has there always been different? I mentioned it earlier on. Like, have there always been competing powers trying to control the narrative, writing history, whatever it is you want to talk about? That's always been a thing. Like, information is power, right? And what we've got right now is information overload. So, it's to be expected. There was. There are examples that we know about where different nations have tried to meddle in each other's elections not in the recent past. But that's
not proven, Jimmy. That sounds like disinformation to me.
Well, fair enough. Okay, so there are. Well,
there are theories.
There are theories, then.
Conspiracy theories about it.
But why would that be a conspiracy theory? Like that for me, that's just like. Yeah,
it's obvious. Why wouldn't you? Sounds terrible, but if you could do it, why wouldn't you do it?
Yeah, and I'm not actually just talking about Russia meddling in the US. Like, the US has meddled all around the world as well,
and internally, in its own affairs.
Yeah, exactly.
And is doing it now. I'm sure.
The point is, like, someone's always trying to control the narrative. Ever since information's been around, ever since someone wrote the first book, the person who wrote the first book was, to a certain extent, getting their ideas across. Now, you could call that controlling the narrative, right? So I think it has always been around. Certainly as long as we've been able to record information. So, since we were recording stuff on parchment, so the challenge now, again, going back to it, is that the ability to do this is on a different scale completely. AI takes it up another notch. Social media took it up a huge notch. The internet and the availability of information took it up a huge notch. AI is going to do the same thing again, possibly on steroids, because anyone is now going to be able to generate. I mean, it's not just written information anymore. It's audio, it's video, it's photos. You can actually generate whatever you want now, or you will be able to in the near future, and all of that's going to get better and better. So trying to decide what information you take in, what you believe, what you don't believe, is just going to get more and more difficult, and hence the whole point of this particular podcast. I'll be honest, I found it. We talked about it earlier on in a little break we had. I found it quite difficult to do this podcast because we don't want to get into any of the specifics, and that's very deliberately. And obviously, there's a lot of sensitive topics that we've talked about. I hope that the overall point that we're getting across is that, we're just trying to take a balanced view of what is information going to look like in the future. How are you going to decide what is information and misinformation, and what to believe and what
or who's going to decide,
decide as well. I mean, you talked earlier a little bit about freedom of speech. I'm a big proponent of freedom of speech. There are limits on freedom of speech. It's not, you can't say anything, you can't incite hatred, you can't do a lot of things. Or I mean, you can, but you'll probably get arrested pretty quickly. Hence why I think Tommy Robinson's in Canada at the moment. But I am a proponent of free speech. I'm a proponent of open source and openness, because to shut things down, in my opinion, is not to have the conversation and not to have the debate at all. And if you regulate too much and if you shut things down too much, then someone's still in control. It's just a central authority, which in my opinion is not actually any better.
Yeah, so I was literally about to say, free speech essentially ensures that those vast swathes of information are going to be there, and government state control limits it, but therefore limits freedoms and takes control of the narrative. So I think, to simplify, but the only way we have harmony, and I'm going to sound like I'm working for a certain state's party here, is we have a more authoritarian controlled state with controlled media. But then that means the complete removal of freedoms and a state controlled narrative. So, you either have safety and security until something major happens and then you realize you have no rights, or you have freedom and safety from totalitarian control, but you have a much more divided society within it, with conflict and potential for, fairly regular unrest.
Yeah, I think so. But I don't know, it's a really hard question, and it's something that's been around for a long time. There's 1984, there's been musings on this for a long time. I'm definitely on the side of free speech and not becoming more authoritarian in this respect, because, as I said, you still have a narrative in that kind of society. It's just a narrative that is controlled. And so I'd rather have the debate and have the conversation and be able to decide for myself.
You've sort of opted out of the information. You've made a conscious choice to avoid social media, etc., which to me sounds almost like it's a contradiction. You want the information out there, but then you're acknowledging that actually it's dangerous. So you're saying, well, I couldn't deal with it, so I just stay away from it. Isn't that a contradiction? Kind of.
I maybe overstated the avoidance of social media. Like, YouTube is social media, and I use YouTube. I just curate the information that I watch some stuff for entertainment, and I read some stuff. I do read some stuff on social media, but I'm very clear in my own head when I'm doing it for entertainment purposes and when I'm doing it because I want to educate myself. And so, I think we all have the ability to do that, to be honest. Like, a lot of the stuff we've talked around today. So whether you call them theories or conspiracy theories, I kind of just take it all. That's the stuff that I take with a pinch of salt. And the reason I take that with a pinch of salt, as opposed to, some of the science stuff that I follow, is because it doesn't, it's all opinion and it's all emotion and it's all got that mixed up in it. And so that's what I'm saying. I'm not going to be able to arrive at an answer, and I shouldn't try to arrive at an answer, because for me that's the danger, and that's what's dividing society. So that's what I'm talking about.
This is a social media rather than an AI point, but I think it's, the social media thing is people talk about it being addictive, and I think it's underplayed. When we talk about being addictive, this is not a kind of metaphor. It literally is addictive in the same way as a drug. There's the whole dopamine hit. I think it's more than that. You get rewired. You almost can't do without it. And this is why it's like a drug is. To me, some of this stuff, when I talk about my personal experiences, for a long time, I stopped looking at Twitter. So I knew for a long time that the answer was don't do it. But it's like you've got it in your hand on your phone, and your hand twitches, right? And wants to look at something, or you're like, how can I bookmark this? I mean, some of the stuff is incredibly interesting. That's the other thing, is like, don't get me wrong, as much as I kind of, ask for all this sympathy about, oh, how terrible it's been for me to have all this information. Well, it's fascinating. Like, some of the stuff is absolutely fascinating, whether it's true or not. Like, it's just fascinating that people have researched and done so much to propose something, to push something, to believe something. Like, in many ways, I admire the people who can make that decision, and say, I believe this, and I'm on that one side. I think the thing for me is, because I'm someone who craves so much information, is I never arrive at a decision, because I've got so many different things in there, and therefore they kind of contradict each other, and it's very difficult to make a decision. But just the looking at information, I think where you differ from most people is because you don't look at that much of the information, you're not drawn in by it, and therefore you are not addicted to it. And so for a lot of people, the addiction it's not far off. Like, it's not a crack addiction, but it's an addiction in a way that, like, giving it up is hard. I mean, how many people, I feel like we've had this conversation before, maybe we've done it on the podcast, so I'm sorry if we have. How many people say, oh yeah, social media, it's terrible, I wish I could delete all my accounts? Well, you can delete all your accounts.
Yeah.
So we all know the answer.
Yeah. I mean, I basically have. I haven't deleted my Facebook because it's got stuff on there that I want to keep, and I was on Facebook for a long time, but not for the last 8 years, I don't think. And I have a lot of friends who are similar. Twitter, I've basically never used Twitter.
Luckily, it seems like Musk might have driven Twitter into the ground. I'm not certain it's going to exist in a few years' time.
I don't know. I think it's still thriving in a way. Actually, did it not have more users in the first quarter this year than it did in the previous year or something?
I mean, this is a great example of information disinformation, because what I read is that it was losing more money than any other business ever from a takeover. And,
oh, really?
And users. I mean, I know users left it initially. Maybe not later. My view is that the money doesn't matter, because Elon bought it because he needs the data for Grok, and I don't think he really. I don't think not cares less is wrong, because it would be great to have control of a media empire, but I don't think it matters ultimately whether X is successful, because once he's crushed all that data, it will be worth more than it would be worth as a social media platform anyway. But I digress. Should we do something a bit more light-hearted? And I think actually it feeds in quite nicely from what you've just said. So have a look at some of the more interesting theories that are out there. So these are, some of them are ones that I personally have come across. I wonder whether, as an experiment at some point, we should come up with something outlandish and see whether we can write a sort of 1,500 word article with some form of references to. I'm doing the thing with my fingers again. Prove it, because it would be interesting. Because some of these, like I say, some of these which seem to be completely outlandish, but actually, like, the articles have got a lot of, what do I call it if it's not evidence? They've got a lot of supporting information behind them. So the one that we discussed this week that I think is one of the most interesting is the iodized salt. So this is in the UK specifically. So someone who is a big consumer of instant noodles, but also is very, very careful about what they put into their own body. So always reads the ingredients on the things that they eat, even though they eat instant noodles. Bit of a contradiction there, but we'll carry on. So they noticed that recently in the UK, pot noodles have started to have iodized salt instead of normal salt added into them. And that hasn't happened for, I believe, 20 something years since iodized salt had been added. I don't know why it was added 20 years ago. Anyway, it's more expensive apparently. And so they then started researching other instant noodles from various supermarkets and brands and found that they'd also been putting iodized salt in. So the theory is the iodized salts, many of you will know that iodine is something that would be given out as tablets in the case of a nuclear weapon strike or a nuclear leak in order to help to mitigate the effects on the body. So the iodized salt is being put in by the British government, presumably because it wants people, when there's a nuclear war, to not die as long as they've eaten pot noodles. The answer was because the kind of people who eat pot noodles are young students and people who don't work or don't earn much, and they're the people who are going to be needed to go and fight in the war, and therefore they're the ones who need to be able to survive a nuclear strike. I'm not sure that any amount of iodine could save you from an actual nuclear strike, let alone some iodized salt. But I know, Jimmy, I know you think this is not a conspiracy. You believe this one, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, you said this was going to be lighthearted. It certainly is lighthearted. Yeah, I think this is just bonkers. I don't know what the background is on it, and I should probably read up on it. But this is exactly what I was talking about with the whole fiction thing. I mean, my guess with this is like someone's realised, as you say, iodine is in something. They've then gone and researched a whole bunch of stuff about what contains iodine, and then that's it. They've probably gone from there and then just constructed this, work of fiction.
I'll try and link it in the show notes, but I might forget, and I'm not sure I want to steer people to this article, to be honest. But it's on Substack. Maybe you can search yourself if you want to find it. The second one, so, I mean, obviously Bill Gates comes up as anything. He's, as we all know, he's part of, if not the founding father of the global cabal. But one of the more interesting ones I heard recently was they were talking about how modified citrus pectin, particularly found in lemons and grapefruits, was very good at dissolving spike protein. And then I heard that that's why Bill Gates tried to get rid of all citrus trees. I mean, I wasn't aware that he was trying to get rid of them. And by the way, here I'm not either for or against Bill Gates and Bill Gates' involvement in charitable adventures, vaccines, whatever. But on this particular issue, I think there is some evidence out there that Bill Gates has actually, or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has supported the planting of extra citrus trees, lemon trees in particular, in various parts of the world. So I think that makes this one a particularly odd one to me.
Yeah, sounds pretty fruity.
Oh, very good. The other one, which is not so much of an individual theory, but part the thing that always makes me really kind of confused by the whole global cabal thing is I think if it was the global cabal is controlling all of the heads of state and they just don't know it, and they're all puppets, and this deep state thing goes deeper than anybody knows, I kind of find that more believable. But the idea that Xi and Putin and Biden and in the past Merkel, etc., they're all on secret phone calls to each other, and they're all kind of in bed together with each other, and they all agree and have these conversations at WEF meetings. I just find this like incredibly well staged.
Yeah, it would be
like unbelievably well staged, and for people who know how random and how just how unstable and messy the world is, how you could manage this level of organisation, to be honest.
Yeah, this is another problem with a lot of these things, right? Is the kind of the level of that's it really, the level of organisation that you would need to have in what is clearly a very disorganized world. Kind of like wish the world was that organized in a way.
Exactly. Yeah, that's my point. Is if only it was that organized, maybe some of the other problems wouldn't be so apparent, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So this is quite an interesting one. So the whole 5G thing. So there was one particular thing I saw, which was that the mRNA vaccines had injected a spider web nanotech into all of us. I mean, it was made of actually the particular web from a particular spider had created the nanotech that's obviously been injected into anyone who took mRNA vaccines. And then 5G being turned on, and then a super powerful AI was going to control everybody. That's, quite far out there. But I wanted to actually just talk to you as someone who is, into science and as a software engineer, 5G and electromagnetic frequencies and their potential effect on the body. Where do you stand on that? Do you think this is complete nonsense, or do you think actually, this is a bit more? This is something that maybe is there is an issue around electromagnetic frequency, and it's been turned into something bigger than it is.
Yeah. So, I mean, specifically on this, a whole bunch of tests were done specifically on 5G because it had to actually pass safety tests to be able to be used in proximity to people. One thing that is true is that like how high power lines, so like if you live near high power lines, like the big power lines that take power across a country, they do have an effect on you. That's been demonstrated. But 5G, like the stuff you're talking about, again, like it's, I mean, you'd have to believe in quite a lot of conspiracies to even get close to believing any of this. And they are tested. They've been tested on people. There's literally loads of papers, loads of scientific tests out there. And what are the effects we're talking about here?
Well, they're using it to control. I mean, there's one thing which is it's being used to control people. The second is that it just causes illness, and actually, the whole kind of pandemic narrative, actually it's illness caused by electromagnetic frequencies that is the whole problem. So I think there are like we said before with the COVID one, where I said there are all kinds of different layers of this. I think with 5G, actually, I laughed initially when at the beginning of COVID talking about injecting with 5G chips, but actually when you look into it more, I'm not saying it's necessarily more believable, but you realize it's much more complex. And I think where I have a real issue with this one is why 5G? Why was 4G okay and 3G was okay, and but like you say, power lines and everything else and Wi-Fi, but 5G was not. And the actual background with this was that the first city to turn on 5G in the world was Wuhan in 2019. Well, it wasn't. It was actually Shanghai, Seoul, and I think surprisingly London, because for anyone who's been to London and tried to use 5G, it's pretty rubbish. But apparently they were the first 3 cities in the world to turn on 5G. So Wuhan wasn't even the first one in China. But that's an interesting one. I think the whole thing about electromagnetic frequencies and radiation, etc. I mean, I'm more concerned actually about the Wi-Fi in my bedroom and having a Wi-Fi router next to my head when I go to sleep, for example, than a 5G tower that is, a few miles away. And I think if people are really worried about it, there are, like you say, power cables. I mean, the houses that we're in, like, get out in nature and get your feet on the ground away from a place that's permanently full of electric cables and power. That to me has a degree of sense. I mean, I think having exposure over a long period of time to too much electricity and radiation, I can see how that has some kind of effect. But this particular thing of 5G, it just seems to me, why is 5G the bad guy and 4G was okay?
Yeah, I think you'd have had a lot more evidence of people being harmed by 5G by now if it was a real thing, which has, as far as I'm aware, has never existed. There's no evidence of that at all. And also, I mean, whose interest is it in for
the global cabal?
Oh, right.
Before
okay,
you even ask the question,
we're going back to that. Yeah. Yeah, but
So sorry, there is a theory as well that the reason for the lockdowns is while the lockdowns were taking place, it was to allow them to install all the 5G towers while the lockdowns were happening. So that was the reason for lockdowns in 2020. But in China, in all the cities like Beijing, Shanghai at that time, there were no lockdowns. So bizarre that they only locked down certain cities but built 5G towers. And of course, all the people putting up 5G towers who, as far as I know, most of them are, paid £50,000 a year. They were apparently in on the whole thing.
Yeah, the whole thing's just bizarre. I mean, that I don't even need to try and discredit because I was alive at the time. So I know. I mean, for starters, 5G was rolled out way before COVID. None of it makes any sense. It's just bizarre. Yeah.
And the last one, which is, I just thought that one of the more amusing. I find this one amusing. I mean, I'm sure there might be people listening to this podcast who now think I'm an idiot, but this idea now that viruses don't exist as they've never been isolated. So, and this, there's quite a lot of people in actually with scientific backgrounds who are now on the bandwagon with this one. So, and people who, didn't start out on there, maybe they've been dragged in, maybe they are in some way corrupted by it. But this I find a really interesting one because this is a really good example for me of when we were talking before about evidence, with me putting my fingers in the air in sort of inverted commas, where people will say, well, there's evidence of viruses. We've seen them on electron microscope. And then people will say, well, how do you prove that's a virus?
You don't.
And this is a really good example of evidence, right? I can say,
but then
say, well, this is black. Yeah, I say, no, it isn't.
But then you're arguing over the definition of a word, not evidence. I mean, you can look at a virus. You don't even need an electron microscope. You just need a microscope, as far as I know. Like anyone can go and have a look at one. It's like
yeah, I agree with you. It's the definition. If a definition of virus is it's just a single-celled organism that can cause people to be sick.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible nothing exists. It's possible we're living in a simulation, and that is actually possible. You can't disprove.
I think that's fairly possible.
So
more and more possible, to be honest.
So I suppose anything's possible. I think I don't know who's saying viruses don't exist because I think with this one I'd never heard of this before. So we're obviously in different rabbit holes on the internet.
I think me and you are in slightly different places with where we've been on sort of social media in the last 18 months, Jimmy.
Yeah, I mean I've heard of the 5G stuff. Bill Gates and citrus trees, never heard of that. I've heard some global cabal stuff, but not the specifics. The viruses not existing thing, I've never heard of that. And I'd probably read it with amusement.
Do you think some of this is being pushed by, as an agenda by certain hostile states? I mean, there is a really famous interview. I can't remember the name, but it was a Russian ex-KGB who defected to the US, and there was a really famous interview with him where he talked about how basically people were being sent into society to just destabilize it and to eventually cause the breakdown of the US. And it would be a very, very, very clever way to do it, to, unsettle society with a lot of these theories. I mean, you've got 30% of people in the US, so, if that's the case, you're doing a very good job. I mean, we can't estimate what percentage, but, how much do you think this is a case of a lot of this stuff is generated by not necessarily just bots, but by hostile organizations or states? And there again, we play into AI being a facilitator because it makes it much, much easier to do it.
Yeah. Well, on that point, I mean, I'm sure that happens all the time. I'm sure that kind of thing, I mean, we know that kind of thing happens all the time. So maybe, but it would be a very long-term, a very smart long-term plan if that is what's going on. Again, with that, it's like, we're never going to know.
If you watch this interview, which, like I say, I think it's from the 80s, he's around sort of 1985, something like that, who defected, he talked about it being a very long-term plan. And I mean, this is not a conspiracy theory. This is someone who defected and said, look, this was the plan.
Yeah.
So I could definitely believe yeah, I don't know how much, but that part of it, there's a conspiracy theory about controlled opposition. If there's a controlled opposition, there's definitely going to be a controlled, what's the opposite of opposition?
Controlled
position.
Controlled position.
Not that, is it? What is the opposite of an opposition? Opposite shun.
Yeah.
Controlled shun.
Controlled shun. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you're getting into stuff there where it's like, yeah, that probably goes on. I'm not going to say that doesn't go on. Like we know that sort of thing goes on all the time. Will it work? Again, like this is where I come back to what I was saying earlier on, but this is why I am a proponent of free speech and critical thinking, because that is actually the defense against this, in my opinion. And I don't think it's a majority that believe a lot of these things, and maybe that's just the way democracy gets shaped. That's the way the world works. And when a majority believes some of these things,
it won't be a conspiracy theory anymore.
It won't be a conspiracy theory anymore. And if they're wrong, then we'll be in a dangerous place.
Let's finish off on, and you did already kind of mention some ideas, but what can we do about this? Not necessarily me and you, and maybe the answer is we can't, but what can people do? What can communities do? What can civilization do to stop this from getting beyond the point of no repair?
I think the horse has bolted in that respect. What I do, and I know I've already rambled on about it, so I won't go into it in much more detail, but, treat everything written on the internet by someone you don't know as a piece of fiction is, I guess, the position I've arrived at. And I don't do that with everything. But there's a lot of stuff that I watch where it's like, there's a really genuinely compelling evidence base for it, and it is something that they can show you the pictures, they can show, and I know it's like, okay, all that could be fake and all the rest of it, but again, I keep going back to it, but I'm talking about science. Like, I follow a load of science channels on YouTube, and there's a load of science channels on YouTube that are complete nonsense, but there's also a load of them which I find to be reliable sources. So to mention a few, there's like PBS Space Time, there's Dr. Becky, who talks about astronomy. And these are like, why do I believe them rather than somebody else? Because I know that they're qualified. Dr. Becky, for example, she's a qualified astronomer in that field. She's talking about like the results that are coming out of JWST. It all agrees with what everybody's saying about.
They put the time into it to gain the credibility, right?
Yeah, they've put the time into it to gain the credibility. And so they've won me over in that sense. And again, this comes back to the whole critical thinking thing, because whenever I'm kind of in some of the other corners of the internet where you're just reading something that a bloke said on Reddit or whatever, it's like, well, yeah, it might be true, it might not. You need to try and verify it somehow.
There is one thing where I kind of take issue with that, or maybe take issue is the wrong, a bit strong. I disagree. Is I think if you look at a lot of this stuff now, there are people with very, very scientific backgrounds, and who are established experts in the field. So I'll give you an example. Gert van den Bosch is a very, very well-known, or I don't know if he's well-known because people don't know virologists, but he's a very well-qualified virologist, and he has a very, very controversial theory about the pandemic and how it's going to end with most vaccinated people, or a lot of vaccinated people very, very sick or dying. Now, he has a very, very strong scientific background, but he has a very, very extreme view. And I think COVID is almost an exception, but I think something happened unprecedented in modern times. It was the big shock of our lives so far in terms of the way that it affected the world. And so it has a kind of, a much bigger effect. And maybe it's not fair to kind of compare this to other eras without going into sort of, similar kind of massive geopolitical shocks. But some of the theories around, even about the viruses not existing, if you look at some of the people who believe that, these are not random people writing on the internet. These are people who've been, ex-managing directors of global pharmaceutical companies and people with really, really, strong scientific backgrounds, which is why I say, are they being paid by hostile states to take this view? Because that almost makes more sense than somebody with that background suddenly being won over, or have they just gone down the rabbit hole as well?
Well, okay. I mean, I can't speak to the COVID example because I don't have the information at hand. But an example of this not so long ago, and maybe this will upset some people, but an example of this was climate change. And irrespective of whether we get whether it's man-made or not, there was a debate not that long ago about climate change, and it turned out and so there were scientific papers out there saying it's not happening or it's not man-made or all the rest of it. And there was then sometime later there was a global study where they looked at all the papers. So there was papers on both sides, but they looked at all the papers and they said, okay, out of all the papers, what percentage of them are saying that climate change is real and it's man-made, and what percentage of them are on the other side of the argument? And I think it came out to something like 99.5% of all papers around climate change were supporting that it was real and that it was man-made. And yes, you will always be able to find arguments on both sides, even within science. I don't know what the situation is with the COVID thing, but my suspicion is that the majority of published scientific stuff is on one side and not on the other. But you'll always be able to find a paper saying, and even from people that have been fairly credible in the past, like it happens. There are, rather than conspiracy theories, I guess fringe theories out there. And you'll always be able to find arguments backing up both sides. So it is tricky. And, you never know. One of the sources that I talked about earlier that I go to for my information might one day start spouting rubbish and become, for whatever reason, become untrustworthy. And that's something that I guess, again, I always have to keep an eye out for.
I'm going to take the sort of end of this episode, and it's sort of weird for me to give advice to people, I guess, bearing in mind what I've said about, how I've personally been struggling with information, or I want to call it information overload. I think that's probably the best way to describe it, rather than information or disinformation. But I think that means I can give some advice, which, one is just don't get dragged into it. Just, don't go down that rabbit hole too far, because you'll find it just never ends. There is just so much information out there that, even if you think you're finding the truth, you'll never find the answer. You'll never find the answer. No. The other thing I just recommend is, and this is advice I am taking myself, is get out there into nature, get away from screens and computers and, the internet and social media, and live in the other world. I don't want to call it the real world, but live in the physical world, because some of this shit, if it happens, then we're all fucked. But, if the worst happens, we're probably not going to stop it. And it's an easy thing to say, but, living in the moment, now it hasn't happened. Now you're still able to do the things that you are doing and, living a life to a certain standard. So, try and spend time as much as possible away from these sources and not get dragged into it. And if you do, just understand that there's a sort of narrative behind it, and it's not always a negative thing. I don't think people are always trying to push an agenda for the wrong reasons, but there's always a narrative there. Whether it's a good or a bad narrative, there is a narrative, and quite often that good narrative is in the in the eye of the beholder. So even people who are doing things for what they perceive are the right reasons, at some point you've got to make a decision what you believe in and what you want to live your life by. And if you find something you're passionate about, then great. But if not, and you don't have a strong belief, then my advice would be just keep living that way and don't get too dragged into it.
I think that's good advice to end on.
So that has been another marathon episode. We will leave you with a second song this week. this one in a slightly different style. And thank you if you listened through till the end. We hope you enjoyed it, or at least got some. At least if you didn't enjoy it, at least you got something out of it, and maybe you will avoid some of the mistakes that I've made. So thanks very much for listening. We will see you all next week with a more normal episode of the podcast. Take care, guys.
Trusts each journal's word, blind to strings that pull unheard. Peer-reviewed reality, big pharma's hidden dynasty. Waves of static wash over me. Truth is blurred, what can we see? Jimmy's content, Matt's on alert. Whose worldview will time assert? Matt sees fiat's crumbling throne, whispers truths through encrypted phone, while Jimmy eats his cricket meal, injected future forced ideal. Waves of static wash over me. Truth is blurred, what can we see? Jimmy's content, Matt's on alert. Whose worldview will time assert? Matt sees fiat's crumbling throne, whispers truths through encrypted phone, while Jimmy eats his cricket meal, injected future forced ideal. Pulses through every stage. Nano chips beneath the skin. Freedom lost or brave new win. Waves of static wash over me. Truth is blurred, what can we see? Jimmy's content, Matt's on alert. Whose worldview will time assert? Worldview will time assert. 15 minutes from your cage. 5G pulses through every stage. Nano chips beneath the skin. Freedom lost or brave new win. Jimmy's lulled by soothing lies. Matt decodes the world's disguise. Sergei's dreams of control unseen. What is real? What does it mean?